think Michaela will be driving the slides from our side of the Atlantic. So, Sheryl, all yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for introducing me and inviting me to come to talk about universal design in higher education, creating an inclusive campus. And it might be guiding a question here. It's not just to you, but to us in the United States. Is it time to stop talking and start doing? Anyway, if you look at the next slide, that summarizes the 2 units that Gerald mentioned. The IT accessibility team is our UW-focused activities to make sure that the IT procured, developed, and used at the University of Washington is accessible to people with disabilities. But the Do It Center is more in line with what I'm talking about today. It's been funded by federal, state, corporate, and private funds over the years. And so has allowed us to expand our efforts and take a little more holistic approach to the success of students with disabilities rather than focusing exclusively on technology. We have a program in Japan, the University of Tokyo, but also, as was mentioned, the Center on Universal Design in Education, which started in 1999, which is very similar to your Center for Excellence in Universal Design that Gerald Craddock is the chief officer for. We are very like-minded in that we see universal design broadly applied to all the things we do, not a limited application, let's say, to learning activities. And so that's where we cross paths a lot, and we both feel the same way about it. So it must be right, Gerald? On the next slide, it kind of gives our kind of a focus of what we do, a model. It's a student-centered community building model where key stakeholders, like all of you and me, that contribute to the success of people with disabilities are energized and taking action. So the problem I see is that some stakeholders are just not doing their share. So in this model, we have the success of people with disabilities in higher education and careers at the center. And then around it has the stakeholders that we focus on in not all of our projects at once, but in all aspects of the projects if you look at them as a whole. And so there's the person with the disability that is key, of course, being prepared for college and careers, their family members, their peers, their near peers, those would be people close in age, adult mentors, and any allies that we can bring to the table, community groups, social programs, service providers, K-12 teachers and counselors, post-secondary administrations, faculty, staff, employers, technology vendors, legislators and policymakers, and funding agencies. And so all of these various stakeholders have a role that could contribute to the success of people with disabilities or not, make it difficult for them to be successful. So on the next slide, I talk about basic approaches with these groups. When we are working with students with disabilities, we promote self-determination. And Michaela, if you could hit return again, we'll get down to the second item on there. When we are working with faculty, staff, institutions, technology companies, we promote universal design, our topic today. And so as far as self-determination, that's a broad term for the various skills and knowledge and preparation students with disabilities need to be successful in college and careers. And so we work with them, summer programs and other activities to help them be prepared to maneuver in a world that's not perfectly designed for them. And then with universal design, we help create a playing field that's level for people with disabilities once they enter educational activities and also employment. So on the next slide, I have it a kind of what I mean by an inclusive environment. It could be an inclusive campus, but it could be any environment. To me, it means that whoever meets the requirements, with or without accommodations, is encouraged to participate. Once they're there, they feel welcome. And they are fully engaged in accessible, inclusive, and sustainable environments and activities. So we don't have to reinvent the wheel to create environments for a particular person. In most cases, we can make sure that that environment and the activities are created proactively. And so the next slide talks about the goal, as I see it, in the United States, and you may adopt it as well, but if not, we'll go on still and talk about other things. But I see we need a paradigm shift. to a more broadly defined inclusive campus. And by a paradigm, I mean a theory or group of ideas about how something should be done, made, or thought about. Like, how should we design a campus? How should we design our courses? And the dominant paradigm is the collection of values, a system of thought in a society or organization that's widely held. It provides an almost unconscious, internalized framework that affects the way people think things should work, and often goes without question. And so on the next slide, I kind of add to this idea historical perspective with just a little 1-minute history lesson on the treatment of marginalized groups. We can see cases in our history as a world, as countries, where we've had eliminated or excluded or at least segregated people with disabilities and other marginalized groups. Sometimes well-meaning people promote these approaches, particularly segregation, where parents might decide to teach a child at home so they will not be bullied in a school setting because of their disability. But unfortunately, that child also missed the value that they could have from that experience if it was more inclusive. And then back, particularly in the middle of the last century, a lot of effort as far as curing disabilities and then rehabilitating and accommodating. Particularly for us after World War II, a lot of our veterans came back to our country who had survived serious and multiple injuries that they would not have survived if they were made in earlier wars. And also in our country after the World War II, we had the GI Bill. And so individuals with disabilities, veterans, could have free tuition for their college education, which meant we had a large number of veterans entering our post-secondary campuses. But the approach was to accommodate them, kind of after the fact, noticing that a classroom isn't accessible, and well, maybe we'll move it, or we'll adjust some furniture, or whatever. But now we're in an era of social justice. We hear about it all over the world. And so if we are in the area of social justice, why should we not think proactively? Why aren't we thinking of making whatever we offer born accessible as much as possible to minimize the accommodations? Because social justice implies that we expect everyone to engage in whatever we're doing. So that leads to efforts like your effort, equality, diversity, and inclusion, EDI. We have a DEI, which is pretty much the same thing here in the United States, that's really taking on a life of its own on our post-secondary campuses. And then the idea of universal design, which gives a framework for adjusting whatever we're offering because of social justice to make it born accessible. On the next one, I think it's useful, on the next slide, it's useful to take a look at ability on a continuum. Some people need to know the definition of specific disabilities and documentation and evaluating that sort of thing, but that's not most of us. I imagine most of us in this meeting today aren't called upon to do that. So I like to think of ability on a continuum that affects everyone. So if we have a continuum that goes from not able on the left to able on the right, we could take the ability to understand English. A person might rate themselves poorly in this area because they are a person who grew up where English was not their first language. And so they're still English language learners. Or it could be related to a reading-related disability that makes it difficult for them to understand English. The point being that being not able to do something or challenged in doing something doesn't necessarily have anything to do with disability. And so maybe it's more useful to look at the abilities people have. I've hired a lot of people in my day, and I never once have ever hired someone for what they're not able to do. It's always for what they're able to do. The next one, social norms, kind of the same thing. Someone might not be able to understand social norms very well because of a disability that makes it difficult to do so. Or it could be simply because they grew up in a different culture and don't understand the social norms of the new community they're living in. So on and on and on, the ability to see, to hear, to walk, to read print, to write with a pen or a pencil, to communicate verbally, to tune out distraction, to learn. All of us in this meeting today could rate ourselves on this continuum from not able to very able. My guess is if we turned in that assignment, there wouldn't be two of us that were the same. because the range in abilities that we have in this world is a normal part of the human experience, not an unusual thing, but just a normal part of the human experience. In the next slide, I have a few notes about the students with disabilities, particularly, that is surprising to some faculty, at least in the United States. Most disabilities are not obvious to others. They're invisible disabilities or not easily recognized disabilities like learning disabilities, attention deficits, and so forth. Most people with disabilities also do not report them to an institution or to their employer. Why? Well, they all have their own reasons, of course, but some report that they're worried about the stigma associated with the disability. For the third bullet on this slide, we also can say that campus disability services offices primarily offer accommodations to individuals after an inaccessibility is discovered. So it's a reactive approach. But if we look at the next slide, a suggestion is that maybe, just maybe, it's the design of the product or environment or the service, whatever we're designing, that should be reconsidered. On the next slide, I have kind of a humorous example of something that isn't designed to be very inclusive, at least for some people, pretty much all people. We have a picture of the coffee pot for masochists, which has the handle and the spout on the same side. I think we'd all agree that this is a poorly designed product and wouldn't go to put in a lot of effort to redesign it in its current form to make it more accessible, or to maybe, take the lid off and pour the coffee from the side. We would expect a better designed coffee pot. And so this is what we're kind of doing when we give an online learning course, for instance, to a student with a disability when that course is not fully designed for them. And so they can't participate and they reach roadblocks or have to do things in a very awkward way. So one thing that in universal design and online learning, by the way, or presentations that we always promote, is to make sure that you speak the content of any image. I just did this. If you didn't happen to notice it, I just said the spout and the handle were on the same side. I don't know if all of you can see my screen. It might be because of a disability that you can't, or not enough bandwidth, or you just choose to turn your images off. And so part of universal design is just figuring out what should I describe here so everybody in my audience can understand what I'm talking about, what the point is. But we don't have to over-describe things by saying the coffee pot is red and so forth. The next slide presents the components of a universal design framework. We'll just talk about a couple of them today. But the scope can be a one campus, all campuses, and actually could be an employer where you can apply universal design. There's a definition I'll share, and principles and guidelines and practices that are well established. And then there's a process of universal design. So getting to the definition on the next slide, universal design is the design of products and environments to be usable by all people to the greatest extent possible without the need for adaptation and specialized design. This is from the Center for Universal Design at North Carolina State University in the United States. But similarly, it's similarly defined in the Disability Act of 2005 in Ireland. But also universal design supports the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, as well as its quality, particularly its quality education and reduced inequities, sustainable development goals. And so universal design shouldn't be looked at as something that's totally isolated. It applies to our legal requirements here in the United States and yours as well, but also more broadly around the world in the Convention on the Rights for Persons with Disabilities of the UN. So what are the characteristics of universal design? The triangle on the next slide shows the three characteristics that I think are most important when you think about universal design of a product or an environment or a service. First of all, it's technically accessible, which means it can technically be accessed by a person with a disability, more focused on the disability aspects. But it's also usable for everyone, including a person with a disability, but for the rest of us too. And I think we've all experienced software where it is maybe well, we can use it technically, but it's not very usable and it's not intuitive on what we need to do at any one time. So that's important as well for universal design. But universal design is also inclusive. And so people are using the product, the same product with maybe flexibility built in. So what I see is the paradigm shift we need on the next slide is we need to move from reactive reliance on accommodations alone to, on the next slide, a more proactive universal design of accessible, inclusive, and sustainable products and environments. Back up one slide, please. And so the second one here is from the design for the average to the design for everyone. And so you think of the average or typical person maybe in designing a course, but universal design challenges you think of the great diversity of the abilities of people with, in your course. And so designing for everyone as much as is possible. We're always on a journey, probably never fully making something universally designed, but we should at least think about it. It shouldn't voluntarily add barriers for some people. Once upon a time, we actually did this. On the next slide, we have an image of the front page of our universal design sidewalk article that appeared in the Daily, which is the UW newspaper for students. So again, this was 1970. This was a young man, on the back of his wheelchair, it says, "Ramp the curbs, get me off the street." And we know today that we have a lot of ramped curbs, little curb cuts, right? All over the world. It's very common practice. But back in the 70s, this was very controversial in our country because of the tremendous cost for putting these little curb cuts into existing sidewalks. We know today that it's just built into the sidewalk design in many cases, and that isn't a lot more expensive because that particular design, our new design, is sustainable. We don't have to go back and retrofit these sidewalks again. Once it's done forever. In the next slide, I make the point that universal design provides inclusive access. So in our case, it's not just compliant with laws that require we make things accessible to people with disabilities. It goes a step further in being inclusive. The first image is a typical one where you walk into a building and there are 2 steps. And so along the side of those steps is a nice shallow ramp for those who can't maneuver the steps. Hitting the return key again here, we go to the next slide, next image on this particular slide. This is another building at our University of Washington, where instead of steps, it has a gradually sloping ramp that goes into the building, and it's very wide. And so if I'm going side by side with a colleague who's using a wheelchair, on the left, we part ways before we go into the building. On the right, we go side by side, and the ramp is wide enough that people can pass us on the other side. Don't get me wrong, there are a lot of steps in this building. We're not advocating that we don't have steps. What we're advocating for in universal design is the primary entrance be the one that is most inclusive. In the next slide, I point out the beneficiaries of another universal design practice, and that is captions on videos. Very useful for someone unable to hear the audio. For English language learners, how about noisy environments or like an airport, or noiseless ones like a baby sleeping in a baby's room? May have a slow internet connection, may want to know the spelling of words, particularly individuals who are deaf or English language learners. It's kind of a mean trick, isn't it, if we don't make those captions be make them more accurate. Like in YouTube, a lot of people don't realize in YouTube you can very easily go in and edit the computer-generated captions that are created and make them more accurate for your video. And then people who want to find the content quickly, they can scan through the captions to find the part in a video where they want to go to. The next slide provides another example of IT that is universally designed. We need to go no further than our smartphones. Our smartphones build in accessibility features. We can change the foreground and background colors. Our phone will talk to us if we'd like that to happen. All sorts of accessibility features that not long ago were add-ons that people with disabilities would use assistive technology that provided those functions. And the other important quality of the universal design of technology is to ensure compatibility with assistive technology, like a Braille embosser for a person who's blind, where they can take text maybe that's appearing on the screen, maybe in a document, and they can use Braille translation software and produce Braille for themselves. This is important. Then the key word here is compatibility, that the technology works with screen readers and other assistive technology commonly available today. So in the next slide, I point out some principles that can be used to apply universal design more broadly on our campuses. I've identified 3 sets of principles that underpin the universal design of higher education for all aspects of education. We're not doing a half-day workshop here, so I'm not going to go into them, but just so you know, there are 7 basic principles of universal design that have been around and practiced since the early 90s, and maybe before. There are also 3 universal design principles for learning that get at the curriculum and pedagogy that someone might use in a class that's online. And then there are 4 principles that underpin the web content accessibility guidelines that are used nationwide. And if you look at the Venn diagram I have here, universal design is the large circle because it covers everything. But WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and the Universal Design for Learning Guidelines actually add some richness for those specific applications to technology and to instruction. So if you go to the next slide, rather than memorize all 14 of these guidelines, in a nutshell, they basically say that we should provide multiple ways for people to learn and to demonstrate what they've learned, provide multiple ways to engage through email, through Zoom, through Microsoft Teams and so forth, and ensure that all the technologies, facilities, services, resources, and strategies are designed to be accessible to individuals with a wide variety of disabilities. And so that kind of summarizes our goal. In the next slide, this is a quote from a Buddhist monk. The first time I read it, I thought, oh, universal design. I'm not sure that is what he meant. But what he did say is when you plant lettuce, if it does not grow well, you don't blame the lettuce. You look for reasons it is not doing well. It may need fertilizer or more water or less sun. And this is often the case with plantings I have, by the way. So we don't blame the plant. We look at creating an environment that's more inclusive and supportive. If we look at students with disabilities as an example, rather than look at the students and say, well, they're not qualified to take this class, they had to drop out because they weren't doing well. We look more closely and see if there's something we could do as an instructor to better include that person. Granted, there are times when the student just isn't doing their homework and whatever, so they have to take their ownership of that, but we do as well. So I recommend we first look to the environment or the product we've created, and then make sure that we provide accommodations. Also, anytime we provide an accommodation, to think broadly about that. Could we have made that accommodation within our whole class? Like using an accessible document, PDFs can be a challenge, more challenging on accessibility than other formats like Microsoft Word or just the content in your learning management system. Maybe we could use a format that's more accessible. And so those documents don't have to be remediated if we have a student, in this case, who's blind or has a learning disability that affects their reading so that they can use it more fully. The next slide really emphasizes how all of these universal design principles can come together and we can create checklists. At our Universal Design and Higher Education Center, we have checklists. I wasn't a big fan of checklists in my early days as far as universal design applications, but I am now because it's what people ask for. Just to get started, how can I get started and what things do I even need to think about? I'll focus on the instruction one here, but to think about things like class climate, how do you develop an inclusive class climate? Interaction with the students, the physical environments and products you're using, the delivery methods you're using, information, resources, and technology, the feedback loop, like providing feedback on at multiple stages in a large project. So a student can be caught if they're going down the wrong path that will lead to a poorly designed project. And looking at the assessment, how inclusive is that? And I have accommodations on there as well, because universal design also folds in accommodations. It doesn't eliminate them, it just minimizes them. In the case of a service, you can look at planning and policies and the evaluation you're using, physical environments and products, staff, information resources and technology, and events. And then there are similar lists for information technology and physical spaces. Moving on to the next slide, though, I'll give you an example of a universal design process that's very relevant in the pandemic. We can encourage instructors in the pandemic, online instructors, to consider the characteristics of students who might enroll and the assistive technologies they might be using. So on the next slide, I have 4 images, and I suggest for universal design, consider who might be in the class, using the IT, a service, a facility, or whatever. So these are for people that I know, but you can adopt them if you'd like. They're part of our programs, or you can, create your own. Because sometimes it's overwhelming for people to think of, well, how many disabilities are there? Well, there are thousands of disabilities. But the things you could think about are their characteristics of these 4 lead you in the right path toward universal design that will benefit students with disabilities. And so the first one here is Adrian. He's deaf. So let's make sure we caption anything that is in a video and transcribe the audio. Anthony has physical disabilities. He has a computer strapped to his wheelchair. He lacks full fine motor skills, so he can press the large characters on his computer to get access to the keyboard. He also does not have a usable voice. So we have his computer interfaced with a phone system, and he also has technology that can translate what he types on the keyboard for someone they can hear it on the telephone, which is really important because he provides technology support for a large company that produces assistive technology and often is providing technology support for parents of children with disabilities similar to his own. Big issue if you're developing IT is that Anthony and others like him can access all of the characters on the keyboard, but not necessarily the mouse. So if someone's creating a website, they need to make sure that the pull-down menus and other features of the website can be accessed using the keyboard alone. For instance, maybe using your arrow keys instead of a mouse. It doesn't interfere with using a mouse for those who want to. It just makes sure the alternative is there. Jessie has a learning disability, and it makes her difficult to get her ideas down on paper and out. And so one of the technologies she uses is screen reader technology to read aloud the characters on the screen, as does Nicole, our last example here, who is blind. And Nicole also needs some formatting within the product in order to have full access to a document, etc. So think of a few people, mobility impairments, hearing impairments, learning disabilities, and visual impairments as you do your design. We created, if you'll see on the next slide, a document that I'm not going to go through in detail today, but it gives you an example of where universal design can lead. 20 tips for teaching an accessible online course, which is actually our most popular publication right now. Has references for how you do these things. And it was developed with reports of online instructors, students with disabilities, and researchers worldwide. I'll give you just a taste of it. In the next slide, we talk about instructional materials. And I've already mentioned kind of avoiding PDFs and Michaela hit the return for going to the individual items. Avoid PDFs, especially the scanned images. Structure headings so that someone like Nicole can use her screen reader to tell her what the headings are, and she can see the organization of the document. Provide descriptive text for hyperlinks rather than click here, and images, because again, screen readers can access that descriptive text and go to a link to a website rather than have to read all the surrounding text. Another one is using large, bold fonts on uncluttered pages, plain backgrounds like I'm doing today, The other one is captioning videos and using accessible tools, which I mentioned a little bit. On the next slide, it's about the instructional methods that teachers might use, making the instructions and expectations clear, addressing a wide range of technology skills by giving them some prompts on how to use the learning management system, etc. The third item on this list is to provide options for communicating. We talked about that a little bit, and provide options for learning and options for demonstrating learning, and then spelling out acronyms and defining jargon and otherwise using plain English. So in conclusion, in the next slide, an attitude, a framework, a goal, a process. Universal design supports social justice. It values diversity, equity, and inclusion. It is proactive, promotes best practices that are sustainable, does not lower standards, can be implemented incrementally, benefits everyone or most everyone, and minimizes the need for accommodations. In the next slide, one other note is to consider using universal design as a topic of instruction as well. We're really promoting this agenda. So in computer science, most of our computer scientists come from our post-secondary institution not even knowing about accessible IT design. And we are partnering with a bunch of companies to push the agenda that faculty members will include universal design in their accessible design in their courses. Engineering, the same thing. We want future engineers to be able to design accessible products. People designing the built environment, courses on that, making physical environments more inclusive. People who are developing communications and learning how to do that. Do they know how to make their communications accessible to people with disabilities? And social work and education. So any course can cover universal design topics. So on the next slide, we won't be covering this today, but to just know where this is all heading, is you can take this universal design framework and create an inclusive campus model. And so you start with your vision. Ours is inclusive campus. Your values, some at the University of Washington, are diversity, equity, inclusion, compliance. And then the framework would be the universal design framework. And you analyze your current practices and then what your new practices should be with the universal design framework, and measure your outputs and outcomes and your impacts. And then you go back and you revise. So you could adapt this for your equality, diversity, inclusion initiatives on your campus, in your region, and even at national levels. And look seriously at what role you can play in all this, because we have a lot of stakeholders here. And on the last slide, I will leave you with just links to two resources. The Center for Excellence in Universal Design in Ireland at universaldesign, one word, .ie, and the Center for Universal Design and Education at uw.edu/DOIT/CUDE. And we even have a 20% discount right now on a new book, Creating Inclusive Learning Opportunities in Higher Education, a Universal Design Toolkit. So if you want more action items on how you might apply universal design in everything you do, you might want to take a look at that book, and certainly the website that we have, as well as the one you already have in your country. And as I said earlier, that we have a lot in common in the approach we're taking at the University of Washington as far as universal design, that we look at it applying to everything that we could be doing. So now we have time for questions and answers.